So there's this new Iron Curtain, but it's not made of steel. It's digital. The old dream, of a borderless global AI, that's pretty much over. What we're seeing instead is this harder reality where nations are building digital walls. And the name for this is sovereign AI.
Yeah, we're in this new phase that experts are calling digital realism. And what that really means is nations are no longer looking at AI as just another piece of software. Nope. Now it's a critical national asset, just as vital as their energy grids or their currency. And this is all being fueled by fears of surveillance, and a real drive to protect their own culture. So the race is on to build what's called a sovereign AI stack. And the sovereign AI stack, what is it? It's basically a complete end-to-end system designed to keep a nation's data and AI models physically and legally inside its own borders. But that leads to the massive question everyone is asking. Can they actually pull it off? Is it even possible?
And that is the heart of the debate we are diving into today. On one side, you have the vision that governments can absolutely pilot these incredibly complex systems. But on the other, you have this reality check that says the technical friction is just too immense, that true digital independence might be nothing more than an illusion.
All right, let's kick things off with the optimistic view. This is called the steer strategy, and it's the argument that yes, governments absolutely have what it takes to do this.
So, proponents of this idea say the game has totally changed. It's no longer enough for governments to just be passive regulators, reacting to whatever big tech does. No way. They argue the role now is to be an active architect, to actually steer the market and get it to build the exact solutions they need for their own digital future.
And this leads to what they call the control, steer, depend framework. It's a three-step process, right? First, the government uses policy and treaties to control the high-level rules. Then it uses smart procurement and funding to steer the market, creating a guaranteed demand for certain technologies. And that, in turn, incentivizes the private sector to go solve the hard technical problems, allowing the government to depend on their specialized expertise. It's a pretty clever model. Now, the absolute key to making this whole strategy work is something called middleware. Think of it as specialized software that acts as a bridge, basically hiding all the gnarly complexity. And the analogy here is just perfect. It's like the TurboTax for AI compliance. You don't need to be a certified public accountant to file your taxes, right? You just use the software. Well, in the same way, a regulator doesn't have to be a world-class cryptographer to make sure an AI is compliant as long as they have the right tools. Okay, but now let's flip the coin and look at the opposing view because, that TurboTax analogy, it sounds fantastic in a PowerPoint presentation, but skeptics argue the physical reality of what's being proposed is way more complicated. The core argument here is that you simply cannot abstract away the foundational layers of technology. It's just not that easy. See, skeptics will tell you that true sovereignty isn't just about software. It's a full-stack discipline. It rests on these 5 critical pillars: the actual hardware infrastructure, the models and data, the laws, a presence in space and at the edge, and, maybe most importantly, the elite human talent. They argue that if you neglect even one of these, especially the people needed to run it all, the entire structure just becomes unstable. That middleware, it's just software. It can't fix a fundamentally weak foundation. And we're not just talking about installing some new programs here. Just look at the sheer density of the technical requirements on this slide. We're talking about things like zero-knowledge machine learning, which is, a way to prove a calculation was done correctly without ever revealing the sensitive data. This stuff requires tamper-proof physical vaults for digital keys and very specific types of server chips. These are not things a typical government IT department can just check off a list. You need deep, specialized expertise just to verify that they're even working correctly.
So here's the crucial point. What actually happens in the real world when a regulator comes up against a technology they don't fully get, like these zero-knowledge proofs? Well, we have documented evidence for this. It leads to regulatory delays of 9 to 12 months. All that bureaucratic friction completely chokes the very innovation the system was supposed to enable in the first place.
Okay, let's try to make all of this a bit more tangible with a real-world example that, funny enough, both sides of this debate point to. It's called the Safari Bridge, and it's this massive AI partnership between the United Arab Emirates and Kenya. So, from the proponent's perspective, this setup is really elegant. The best way to think of it is like a bank safe deposit box. Kenya provides the vault, that's the data plane, where all the information physically lives and never ever leaves Nairobi. Meanwhile, the UAE investor, who funded the whole thing, holds the only cryptographic key, that's the control plane, which dictates access from thousands of miles away. It's a brilliant way to separate control from data, hiding all that complexity.
But then you hear the other side, and the argument is you can't just abstract away physical reality. It's like building a fortress with these incredibly thick steel doors, but you've built it on top of a swamp. Sure, the doors are strong, but the foundation is weak. To mathematically prove that separation, to prove the UAE key is truly the only one, the system requires very specific server chips and, crucially, elite human talent to verify the complex cryptographic proofs those chips generate. And really, that brings us to the absolute core of the skeptical view. If a government can't verify the math itself, it's not actually achieving strategic independence. What it's really doing is just outsourcing its national security to a startup and blindly trusting whatever a dashboard tells them. And that, they argue, is not sovereignty.
So this brings us to what might be the ultimate bottleneck, the point where this whole technical debate crashes right into a much more human problem.
You see, you just can't buy an off-the-shelf TurboTax for AI compliance when the tax code you're dealing with is human culture itself. Bias is intensely local. A standardized AI safety tool that was trained in Silicon Valley is almost guaranteed to miss the complex ethnic and linguistic nuances of, say, East Africa, like the subtleties of the Swahili language or the evolving Shang dialect that you hear all over Nairobi.
And this really is the crux of the problem. Proponents will say, hey, the state's steer strategy will create a market for local startups to solve this very problem. But the skeptic's question is incredibly powerful. Who audits the auditor? If you don't have an elite AI team sitting inside the government continuously evaluating these models, you run the risk that these automated tools will just end up institutionalizing the very biases or foreign dependencies the state was trying to avoid in the first place. And then there's just the staggering economic reality of it all. To actually maintain these sovereign stacks, governments might need to spend at least 1% of their entire GDP every year by 2029. I mean, the infrastructure costs alone are just astronomical. It could potentially price smaller nations, especially those in the global south, completely out of the game.
But proponents fire back, arguing the alternative is way more costly in the long run. The cost of not investing, they say, is basically forfeiting your future economic relevance entirely. Nations would end up having to outsource their own local intelligence only to buy it back later at a massive premium from foreign companies. So yeah, the initial investment is immense, but they see it as building the foundational infrastructure of the entire 21st century economy. You know, what's really fascinating here is that after all this back and forth, both sides of the debate pretty much land on the same conclusion. The real challenge in the coming years isn't actually the technology. For the most part, the tech is ready. The primary bottleneck is the capacity of our human institutions to absorb, regulate, and manage it all securely. So, the tools to build these sovereign AI stacks, they exist. The cryptography is sound, the hardware is available, but the real question we're left with isn't whether we can build these digital fortresses. It's what kind of world are we creating when we do? You know, will they be shields that protect national identity and culture, or will they become echo chambers that just shut us off from one another? That is the human puzzle we now have to solve.